So I invite the audience to raise further comments or questions to both of our speakers and open the general debate. Ivor. You wait a moment for the microphone.
Thank you very much. So I suppose this looks like a southern conspiracy here, because I too am South African. So thank you very much for some very interesting and quite provocative points. And I have a question for both of you, because one of the things that is surprising about what's happening in Europe, but especially in America, is a sense that what is, and I think Aurea, you put it very nicely. I mean, the crisis which we've seen here is a particular version of how markets operate. I mean, we've had since the 1980s the kind of hegemony, which for those of us who are not in the United States or in Europe we're just amazed by, of this kind of notion of free markets, that free markets somehow are self-regulating, etc. And I think a lot of people had a sense that 2008 was coming long before 2008, precisely because this, I mean, Polanyi was saying this in the 20s, in response to Hayek, this stuff doesn't work. And yet you had since the 1980s the hegemony of this idea and tried to transplant it in South Africa, not successfully. So what seems to me so amazing as a South African in Europe and looking at America is, how is it that, and perhaps it's different in Spain, I'm not sure, but especially in the US and in parts of Europe, the interpretation of the crisis is not that a particular model of free market capitalism has failed, but rather, and this is what I find just incredible, is that somehow welfare or the welfare state or social democracies failed. And it seems to be so political. It seems like in such class terms that, the perpetrators of a great crisis seem to have blamed the victims. And am I getting it wrong? Am I missing out something? Or how would you understand what's happening in Europe?
Thank you, Ivor. We can take one or two more questions and then to open up the general discussion, and then let Aurea and Jacob respond. Are there more comments? Yes, please. Romy.
Voy a hablar en un confortable.
I'm going to speak in Spanish. I feel more comfortable speaking Spanish. Thank you so much for both presentations. I have a question for each of you. Aurea, I agree with Jacob because he said that civil society in Brazil, the way it's made up, cannot explain exactly the resistance to the crisis, or at least not fully. And I'm saying this because although some southern countries like Chile and Brazil have similar trajectories regarding growth and also the decrease of the Gini index in terms of equality, the civil society is made up quite differently. In Chile, this growth was not a reality because participation increased. Of course, there have been revolutionary movements, but there is no procedural channel that would allow this mobilization to be part of the state, to enter the state. But both countries have faced the financial crisis quite well if we pay attention to the macroeconomical factors. So my opinion is, what else do you think could explain this resistance to the crisis from the economic point of view? Now, my other question for Jacob is the following. It has to do about the hospitality. You were saying that we should promote this idea of hospitality in Europe, or at least to promote the idea of Europe in Europe. And several lectures ago, we had Juan Diez who was speaking about a similar topic, but he was using indicators from a European survey. And according to that study, even marriages between Europeans from different countries are very low in Europe. It doesn't tend to happen. That idea of Europe within Europe is a utopia. So how can you promote that idea of Europe, including, of course, South Africa and Latin America?
One more comment or question? Maybe? Yes, please.
The global perspective both speakers have brought to the debate has been very interesting. Many of us in Spain and in Europe feel indignant about the crisis, to give it a name. There could be others. And in particular, many of us feel indignant at the corrupt behavior of many of our political leaders. I'd be very interested to hear the two speakers' views on that.
Thank you very much. Go back. Jacob, do you want to start in the second round?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, and thanks, Romy, and thanks, Iva, for those questions. And of course, Peter's comments are at the back of my mind. That there's a moment in Salman Rushdie's. I have to remember this. It's been a while now, but there's a moment where one of the characters complains that the trouble with the British is that their history happened elsewhere. And in some ways, I mean, that's the trouble with with Europe. Whatever definition we want to give it, that its history is as much local as it is global. And I mean, I didn't know the statistic about the low intermarriage rates. That is quite interesting. And of course, it raises all kinds of questions about what kind of hospitality we can expect. And the notion of hospitality that I'm thinking of Levinas here. Without corrupting his argument, but I'm not thinking of hospitality as welfare. I'm not thinking of hospitality as foreign aid. That's actually, I think that'd be one useful way of thinking about it. That it's a different kind of hospitality. It's a hospitality that is not mesmerized by difference. It's a hospitality that doesn't read the human body. I mean, it's quite remarkable for how a lot of racialized thinking starts from the assumption that one can read the human body and one can understand, that one can trust the human body, which is quite remarkable because, of all places, you think that Europe after the Holocaust would know that that kind of thinking, doesn't quite work. And of course, I'm not answering Romy's question, I know, but I guess what I'm trying to say, Romy, is that I'd like to see a more, a more open-ended notion of hospitality, and one that's not founded on foreign aid, and one that's not founded on gradations about who's developed and who's underdeveloped, but is founded on a basic recognition of certain fundamental rights about which we're entitled to. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So, we moved here. We moved here after the Conservatives took over. After Rajoy took over, and we tried to sign up my family on the card system, for example, and we were told when we went to the local office, where we sign up, that actually that's one of the first things that the Conservatives took away. This idea that as a foreigner who's here, legally, whatever, you can get in the system. That was one of the first things they took away, and of course it's easy, to take something like that away because if you're doing it to the other. But then again, as we know from violence in Europe, for example, the other very gradually becomes the you. And then violence is a logic of its own. So that's what I'll say to you. And I'm sure I'm not doing justice to your question. And then Iva, let me just, in fact, I think the two questions are connected. Sorry, I don't know your name, so I can't refer to you by name. I apologize. So I've lived in the U.S. for 8 years, and I too find it quite remarkable. I find it quite remarkable that there's this very naturalized way of talking about the crisis, and at the same time there's this very unquestioning acceptance of the fact that some banks are just too big to fail. So you've got to save them, and while saving those banks as the state, you've also got to pay bonuses to the executives who ran those banks to the ground in the first place. And that I just find astounding. But I find worse. And I've also been a journalist for 20 years, and I can't, with all due respect to Americans in the audience, I cannot abide the American media. I cannot abide this fixation on balance. This idea that it really doesn't matter what the Republican says. If a Democrat says one thing, the Republican can say whatever. For you as a journalist to be fair, you've got to treat them equally. So a Republican might say, well, there's no such thing as global warming, for example, and then a Democrat will say, well, but here's the evidence. I mean, I'm showing my own biases, obviously, and a Democrat might say, well, here's the evidence, but you believe what you believe, and the media, instead of calling you out and saying, but this is nonsense. We'll say, oh, well, Mr. So-and-so thinks this and Mr. So-and-so thinks that, and that's all there is to it, And in some ways, I think this feeds us this naturalization of this language of crisis, this idea that the system itself is fundamentally okay. It's the poor, who are leeching the system, for example, who are the problem. So you look at, Obama himself is quite guilty of this. You look at the concessions that Obama has offered as a way of reaching the grand bargain, with the Republicans of the U.S. budget crisis, for example. A lot of it, is on the backs of the poor. Who will see the welfare checks reduced, who will see the welfare services eliminated, and So it is astounding. It's absolutely, absolutely astounding. Yeah, I should stop there.
Thank you. Aurea.
So I will start by the question that Tom has put to us, because it's a very important one. I mean, I think we should keep in mind what I was trying to say in the beginning, that, I mean, to talk about anything that you can regard it as these broader categories, as South, as Latin America, as a country, anything like that, you should look at what's going on in any local level that we're working with. But I'm starting by that to say that I'm not trying to relativize my argument, because I do believe that in Latin America in general, you are having a kind of democratic protection against what's going on in terms of the crisis of the capitalism and of the unregulated market. And if you go and look to the Chilean history and why it's different from Brazil, it's very different. But I mean, in what sense? The civil society in Chile, I mean, much before what you have with Salvador Allende, historically, the civil society in Chile, I would say that they are very strong, but they don't act inside the state. They don't have this thing that we are observing in Brazil as the civil society becoming historically, because it's not completely a new thing, because as I said, I was trying to say in my talk, with the Movimento Sanitarista, with the sanitary movement, one of the key flags that in the 60s they were rising, they were putting that we need to be inside the state if you want to become part of if you want to have the public policy that you want to have. So I mean, it's a kind of if you go and look for some key social movement that's being operated in Brazil from the very beginning, they are trying to be inside the state. And I mean, I might be wrong. I mean, I studied Chile a bit, but I haven't been done, or I should had done, because I should have been keeping like very updating myself all the time with the Chilean what's going on in there now in terms of social transformation. But as far as I remember, as far as I got it, there is this different. I mean, the civil society is very strong in Chile. I'm always saying that I never seen anything like it like what it happened in Chile in the 60s and the 70s before the dictatorship, in terms of social fever, in terms of social mobilization. I never seen anything like that. It's quite astonishing. But if I'm not mistaken, they never try to be an actor inside the state, and that would be a difference that I would remark. But it doesn't say that. I believe that what I was trying to say about this democratic control of capitalism that we're observing in Brazil is not true. Of course, it's a variable among others, as I said before, but it's a very strong one. I'm sure that if Fernando Henrique was in the power, if you had something different, if Lula was in the power in the beginning and Fernando Henrique was the president during the neoliberal era in Brazil, the highest point of that. Brazil and Chile too, if the years of transitions, if you change the leaders and if you put them now, Chile and Brazil and other economies and countries in Latin America would felt a bit would be a bit more damaged for this moment of crisis. And that's one of the points that I will try to keep. And so. What's your name? Sorry.
Christoph.
Yeah, Christoph. Yeah, thanks so much for your question. And I'm going to do the same thing as Jacob done, to try to put your comment together with Ivo one. I mean, one of the good things, I love this idea of denaturalize things, and I like the word that Jacob said. And of the thing that's about this crisis, that it was always put me a bit like upset with the analysis that I was reading, is about the naturalized way to work with the things. The first one is the idea of globe. That's quite terrible. I mean, it seems like nothing has happened in the world in the last 20 years, and the U.S., the United States of America, and Europe is still being in the center of everything. And it describes. I mean, if I got your point, and as I'm trying to put and in the way that I'm trying to approximate your point with what Ivo was saying, is that I do believe that, in my view, that's one of my arguments, that this thing about Europe and the US being the center of the world, being the center of the globe, it's a completely naturalized thing that we should denaturalize it through historical knowledge and historical research. And I think this crisis now show this thing about the welfare state and the failure of the welfare state, it can help us to think about it in a very strong way, and I think Jacob was doing that. I was in the UK in 2010, and it was my closest experience in Europe of the moment. Of the moment of Krise, and it was quite astonishing because I was reading the discourse about the Krise, and they were saying all the time that the Krise was a Krise of the project, was a Krise of the project of the welfare state, of the state controlling the market, or something like that. And for me, it's not like that. The outcome of the crisis now, and the outcome in terms of how nations has been affected by the crisis, is a clear example of what Jacob was saying. There is nothing natural with that. There is no crisis with the. I believe that if there is a crisis I didn't make this point very strong in my paper, but if there is a crisis of the welfare state project, the crisis in the subject of this welfare state. I think the welfare state project was very strongly built on the idea of labor and capital, and the idea of the state protecting the labor and things like that, and creating universal ways to protect it. This thing, I think, has changed a bit. You need to think about a welfare state that can be that can work with a civil society in a broader terms. I think that's it.
Thank you. We open for a second round of discussion. Gerard?
No sé si parlar un confortable català o...
I don't know if I should speak in a comfortable Catalan. No, but I'm not going.
Comparison to Spain as well. If I'm not wrong, both South Africa and Brazil have been from the beginning of the 20th century, ending of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, correct me, Aurea, if I'm wrong with Brazil, they have been embedded in the world economy. Spain not. And then my question would be, if both Brazil and South Africa didn't have, politics is important, but the economy as well. So I would like to know, if it mattered at the moment of political emancipation, the way the economy was embedded in the world economy. Because, in the case of Spain, it's a completely different situation, so...
Thank you, Gerard. There's another comment, Jared Delenti.
Yes, South Africa and Brazil are both national nation states. So civil society was focused on the state to reform the state, but Europe is not organized as a nation state, even though the EU has some features of a state. The fact is it's not a state, and civil society in Europe is fragmented in ways that it probably wasn't in South Africa and Brazil. So my question, which is probably one that has no answer, is how can civil society be mobilized to strengthen democracy? I think that's one of the conclusions in a situation of pretty weak transnational activism in Europe. I see that as a big problem, but I agree that's the way the problem should be posed.
Is there a further comment in this round? Yes, please. Here in the front, please.
Buenas tardes.
I'm going to speak Spanish because my English is very poor. I would like to ask you something which is probably difficult to answer, but I would like to know your point of view about that. You said that one of the solutions that there is for the European crisis would be to enhance participatory democracy. And do you know about any not so utopian solution? Because I think that's very difficult to achieve. And also, in your case, you have gone through several crises. You have probably a more global view of what Europe is. What is your prognosis? What is your forecast to get out of the crisis in Europe? Do you think that it will get out of the crisis? When? And Jacob, you have talked about the role of the media very briefly, but I would like to know whether you still think that there is this fourth power, this fourth estate, which is the press, which is important or not, or are media more increasingly politicized? Are they increasingly political? Do they not tell about reality as it is anymore? Do you believe that media playing more the role of the state PA system or not? Thank you very much.
I'll try to be briefly. I wasn't in the last time. So Gerard Husik, economic does matter in this case, and I mean, what I was trying to do here. I was trying to talk first of all, as I said before, for the perspective that I know better. And I mean, if you go and look for the economic section of the economic embedment of the the embedment of the Brazilian economy in the world market, I mean, you could go. As Jacob said, capitalism is a global phenomenon since the very beginning, and you've been part of the thing since the very beginning. But what's changed in my view, and I would be a bit stronger in this point. I'm not saying that I'm not talking about economic matters. It's first of all because it's not my strong field, but because I do believe, as I was trying to say, that you should try to think more about how the political, how the sphere of power can drive economic decision, and can be one of the main variables to think about how economic life is going on. That would be my very quick answer to you. And for Jared Delante, what I would say is that, as I said in the paper, I do believe that despite the level that we're working with, it's possible. And then I'm going, ¿cómo se llama? Mila, and then I'm going to put your point a bit close to what Mila was trying to say. I think that participatory democracy is not a very utopian thing. I mean, it's quite reasonable. I mean, it's quite easy to do so. You don't in Brazil. If you don't in Brazil, it's because it's easy. I mean, it's a joke, but I mean, it's like playing football. It's very easy. You know how to play. I mean, it's a kind of joke, but I think it's not a utopian project. I mean, if you can find ways to organize, civil society is organized in very different ways. The thing is, how can you use this energy that's being canalized? I don't know if that's a word in English. That's being on the power of the civil society to become also an agent inside the state. And I think you can have institutional means to do that. And I do believe that's possible to do that in European level. I mean, I can, as you said before, to me, I mean, if you go to Brussels, one of the places where you have more lobbies group acting all the time, why you cannot just like replace these lobbying groups of interest for things like that? I mean, for people from, I mean, in Brazil, we've been paying to talk about these councils. If you are in the northeast of Brazil, if you need to take a flight that is going to take you, I don't know, maybe 4 hours to go from the north to Brasilia to participate on the national council's meetings, the government is paying for that. I mean, it's possible to find ways, institutional ways to do so. It's a question of political will, and I think that's the point.
I agree with Aurea. Maybe start with Miller's question. And of course, Miller, we want to be careful that I mean, I know I did this in my own observations about the U.S. media, so please, I qualify that. We also want to be careful that we don't make declarative statement about the media doing this, the media doing that, because there are all kinds of different interests, all kinds of different personalities, different histories that influence how newspapers operate, how newsrooms operate. So we can't make the argument that. We can't make the argument that the media is the fourth estate, or that the media just works as a PR agency for any government, because I don't think that argument would hold. But having said that, I recall reading an essay by Susan Sontag a while back, and one of the points she made And it was all about reading publics. It was all about media and what people read and what people have access to. And then he used Marx, Karl Marx as an example. He just based on reading his work, and then of course not all of it because that's quite substantial. You get the sense that Marx read everything that crossed his path. You get the sense that he read everything he could lay his eyes on. Now compare that to what's going on today with politicians. Let's take the U.S. as a good example, right? That you take your politics where you want to take it. If you're conservative and you believe that homosexuality is wrong and you believe that there's no such thing as global warming, what do? You just watch Fox News. That's all you have to do. And reality doesn't have to, impinge on your worldview because you have it given to you. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems. And if you can't say that Fox News is a government PR agency because it's not. So I think we need to complicate that. And of course, yeah. The other Jared is gone. So Jared, your point is well taken that Europe is not a nation state. But I think that the point that needs emphasizing is that it might not be a nation state, but it is possible. I think as Aurea says, it is possible in some ways for it to function. To function. Obviously not without complications, but it is possible for it to function in sync. Is a weak expression I would use because I can't think of a better expression. And then connecting your observation to Gerard's point, what was also very interesting. So let's take South African mining as a good example. So what do you have in South Africa? You have the discovery of gold, and of course Africans have been mining gold for centuries before this. But what changes, what is significant, is that for the first time in 1886, you have the industrial development of mining as an enterprise. And for this to work, what do you need? You need Australian engineers, you need American engineers, you need German technology, you need British British technicians, you need American money and American expertise. But more crucially, and this is where we might want to complicate the idea of the nation state, but you also need vast pools of human bodies. So at its height, the South African mining industry was drawing people from as far afield as Tanzania. That's all the way up in East Africa. At its height, people were coming that far, and some of them actually walking. To get to the mine, because that's where it was at. And of course, there are all kinds of explanations that we won't get into. And it was also interesting about the development of mining in South Africa as an enterprise, is that for the longest time, because you're so far away, it's still South Africa's fundamental problem in lots of ways, that you're so far away from the people you want to sell your things to, that there's very little that you can control by way of costs. So historically, what would happen is that the only cost you could control was how much you pay people. So you racialize the labor force. You pay European workers more, and you pay Africans a pittance, and you use the state to make sure that this stays in place. And historically, in fact, it doesn't change until I've seen a figure, and Ivor, Sam can help me out on this one. I've seen a figure that says that I think in '77, on average, black miners in South Africa were earning what they were earning in the late 1800s. On average. It's scandalous, it's ridiculous. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that this enterprise was born global, with expertise from around the world. And so in some ways, that might be a starting point of thinking about, global connections.
Thank you, Jacob. We would have a few minutes more for... Thank you. We would have a few minutes more for further comments or questions, if there are any. If there aren't at the moment from the audience, I would like to raise two issues which kept occurring to me while the discussion was ongoing. The first is maybe less a comment to the two speakers, but a question to the audience, to us living here mostly. I think what is striking in both of the analyses of South Africa and Brazil is that we've seen that we were speaking from a historical context of oppression and resistance to it, but both speakers have emphasized then participation and indeed confidence in politics. I think that was Jacob's term. And I think we have in Europe a situation where those who are critical of the current situation, they rather quickly get to the point where on the one side capitalism or the free markets are blamed for all the ills, so that the solution is to abolish them, or that the political system is corrupt to the bottom, so that also somehow we need to get rid of that. Whereas I think, with all critical perspective in both of these speakers, I think what has been analyzed here as the experience is that one rather has to engage and appropriate the economic and political circumstances one finds themselves in, to in that sense have an active and involved position, which then indeed may be able to turn things around. And that may be broadly absent from European debates or too weak in European debates, especially on the critical side. That's my question to the audience. Now my question maybe to the two speakers is you both have set the analysis of Brazil and South Africa in the context also of a global history and of a currently changing global constellation. And I think that is very important to get beyond European parochialism, but it's also significant in terms of trying to understand what a possible exit in Europe from the European crisis might be in terms of a global constellation. Because it seems to me that when we are talking about the crisis of the euro, what is often hidden behind the topicality, and certainly the serious problems there are, is a sense of understanding how the European role in the world economy is changing. And it's not naturally changing for the better, especially because with this unfortunate term, because there are emergent societies. I mean, societies have been there all along. They are not emerging at all. But that in the that Europeans, over their own crisis, they tend to forget that the global constellation, economically and politically, is changing. And there I wonder whether you might want to comment on that as well in conclusion. But maybe there is someone in the audience who wants to comment on my first remark, or maybe you as well, in the sense of whether what I've been saying matches your observations of how you see critical Europeans debating here in Barcelona. Any comment from the audience? If not, I will give the word for a final statement to the two speakers. Jacob, will you go ahead this time?
Yeah, I mean, I need to, give a lot of what we've talked about some more thought. But I agree with you, Peter, that I think one of the key challenges confronting Europe as a constellation of nation states is a rediscovery of its globalness, or a rediscovery of its global history. And of course, what is interesting, and this takes me back to Miller's question about the media, what is quite interesting about this is that in the academy, there's actually a ton of work that is being done or has been done to show just how global the world is. I'm thinking of the work of Sandra Halprin, for example, but I'm also thinking of a book like Sven Lindqvist's Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a rereading of Joseph Conrad's Out of Darkness, but reading it as a way of trying to appreciate European history from a different vantage point, and then that's to try and understand Europe from Africa, for example. And I'm also thinking of the work of Fred Cooper, whom I mentioned earlier, who's interested in the making, or the constant making of French identity, for example. I mean, we might want to think in the Spanish context. We might want to think, of the relationship between Spain and Morocco, for example. We might want to think of the, this is maybe a bit of a sore point. If you read Arthur Koestler's account, for example, of the Spanish Civil War, one of the outrages in Europe at the time is that Franco, had the temerity to use North Africans, to invade Catalonia. And of course, something that is interesting because it also has a history. It has 700 years of North African occupation of Southern Europe. But the point is, I think to go back to a very global point that doesn't, answer your question specifically. I think we do need to rediscover, these global connections, but in ways that do justice to local specificities. in ways that help us account for what Romy was saying, for example. I mean, I didn't know this. I find this quite astounding, that the intermarriage rates across Europe are quite low. I mean, this is very interesting for me. And then finally, just as a throwaway remark and as a conclusion, Ivor told me the other day that on average, South African public servants actually earn more than German public servants. It's a throwaway remark that is not connected to anything, obviously, but I was just stunned by that. I was absolutely stunned by that, given the difference in the sizes of the economy and all kinds of other things. But I'll leave it at that. And if you want elaboration, I was sitting at the back there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Aurea?
Yeah. It's on. Yeah. I could just say I agree with Jacob and finish the thing here, but because that's what would be fair to say. Yeah, but just to qualify a bit more, I'm going to say that I think this global connection and the global constellation above all should be also something that you need to reflect a lot about and to think about the change in the global constellation, because I'm always saying that always when I see this argument about the complexity of the contemporary world, I imagine myself living in the beginning of the 19th century, and I cannot imagine a world more complex than that one. Do you know this? What I'm trying to say by that is just a very simple thing. Is that the modern history, it's always a history in change of the global constellation. I mean, the global constellation is the global connections. It's always putting something new in terms of change in the global constellation and in the way that us put ourselves in this thing called global, or in this thing called the world. Just to the global constellation has changed a lot in the last decades, especially in the last decade. Yes, it has, but to think about how this global constellation really matters for the things that we are trying to think together here today and in the whole series of seminar. I think we do need to keep with what Jacob was trying to say about to look at the and I was trying to say, as I think that's why you are quite close in our comments here, about what's going on in local levels and how these local connections and the connection with the local, with the general, has been operating in this modern history. And I don't know if I got exactly the point that you are trying to put for us here now, Peter, but that would be something that I would like to say, and I think I can just stay with that now and say thank you to you all.
Thank you very much, Aurea and Jacob. I have a bit the feeling that, especially with today's discussion and with the additional perspectives Aurea, Mota and Jacob Dlamini have brought into our discussions, that we could start all over again and review what we have been doing from the first session in the light of what we have been doing today. And in that light, I know that I probably will anyway be inclined on the third Monday in December to come back here and then just to see that nothing is planned for that day. So we conclude our cycle of debates about the European crisis as possibly a crisis of Europe. And as a last word, I just want to thank Marion Hase and the Goethe-Institut again for making all of this possible, and obviously our today's speakers, Aurea, Mota and Jacob Dlamini, for the discussion today. Thank you very much altogether.